Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Friends of the Dar, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Dar al-Athar al-Islamiyyah is pleased to welcome a scholar who has spoken here before in February 2010. Alain George delivered a lecture entitled On the Rise and Meaning of Islamic Calligraphy. The title of his lecture reflected his research that resulted in the book he wrote by a similar title, The Rise of Islamic Calligraphy, published in the same year, 2010. It has always been the goal of the Dar to keep our audience in touch with the current research. And it is especially so when both that topic and the one tonight coincide with the speaker's recent activity. Dr. George is IMP Professor of Islamic Art and Architecture at the University of Oxford's Khalili Research Center for the Art and Material Culture of the Middle East and Wolfson College, as well as Senior Lecturer at the University of Edinburgh. He has published copiously, particularly but not exclusively, on the subject of Islamic art and Arabic calligraphy. Tonight's talk is entitled A Brief History of Arabic Calligraphy through the al-Sabah collection. The lecture is in one sense a continuation of last week's discussion, that is, on the origins of the Arabic language. That lecture dealt with the Arabic script in the pre-Islamic times. Professor George is also dealing with the Arabic script, but this time not on brief inscriptions, but rather the art form that had developed using a much more refined Arabic script as the foremost art form in the Islamic world. As the Islamic world enlarged and engulfed many ancient cultures, Arabic became the lingua franca of that world. Farsi, for instance, became written with a variation of Arabic script. In our current period, it is now possible to write messages in Arabic in our current lingua franca. You know what I'm referring to, so please turn them off and let's welcome Professor Alain George.
Thank you very much for this generous and detailed introduction. I should just say that I'm no longer at Edinburgh. I've moved to Oxford, just so there are no rumors that I have a clone that's working in Scotland while I pretend to be doing things in England. Thank you. And first of all, I would like to thank Sheikh Houssa and Dar al-Athar for inviting me again. It's always a great pleasure to be here. And I also want to thank the collection, the team at the collection, especially Sue Kaougji and Mutlaq al-Juraid, who've always welcomed me so warmly over the years here. So let me explain first the reason why I've chosen this topic tonight. There are two reasons. One is that for a number of years, I've been working on a catalog of the religious manuscripts of the al-Sabah collection, mostly manuscripts of the Quran. It's a compact collection by the standards of, let's say, the Bibliothèque Nationale, the British Library, but it's very rich, and I have been working on it for a number of years. So I am giving you tonight a foretaste of what will come in that forthcoming publication. And there's a second reason as well, which is that, as you know, calligraphy is, you can say, the most revered of the visual arts historically in the Islamic world. But until recently, it's been very poorly known, relatively speaking. And when the study of Islamic art began, in modern terms, in the late 19th, early 20th century, Western scholars were naturally drawn towards things like figural painting. And so we have been in a situation with calligraphy that you could compare theoretically to, if you place yourself in Italy, a situation where we don't really know who Giotto was and what Giotto painted. We know very little about Leonardo, and even less about the other less famous artists and developments that existed. But this has been changing, especially over the last decades. Decade without S, sorry. There's been a number of scholars, and I'm only one of them, who've really been developing new insights about very different areas in the history of Islamic calligraphy. So we're at quite an exciting moment as historians, which is the moment when the broad outline of this history is beginning to emerge with more clarity. But we also know that there is a lot more to be discovered. As Oleg Grabar, a famous historian of Islamic art who's passed away a few years ago, used to say, the history of Islamic art is like a feast in which there is plenty of food for everyone, and that is the historians, of course. So we're going to chart, very briefly, of course, a development that takes us from the pre-Islamic period, when Arabic script begins, until present times, when people develop calligraphy in all sorts of different forms. Technically, as you may have heard last week, perhaps, the Arabic script is late Nabataean. It's a late offshoot of the Nabataean script, and the Nabataeans are for their central city, Petra, in modern Jordan. These people, and there are debates about whether they spoke Arabic or Aramaic or a mixture of both. People tend to think it's Arabic nowadays, or a version of a form of Arabic. The Nabataeans adopt the Aramaic script for their written documents in antiquity. And as you know, before Islam, the culture of Arabia at large is predominantly oral. People memorize literature. They don't write it. And so they still use script, but occasionally. And so epigraphers have discovered thousands of pre-Islamic inscriptions in the Arabian desert, most of them probably written by bored pastoralists who were attending their cattle or maybe traveling. And we suspect from sources that writing was occasionally used before Islam, for instance, for correspondence. When they wrote, the Arabs in that period borrowed the local script of prestige. They did it with Aramaic, Nabataean. They also did it with Greek, South Arabian, and so on. Between the 4th and 6th centuries, there is a development of a specific strain of the Nabataean script, and this is the classical Nabataean script. It's the oldest inscription in Arabic language, which is in this script. There is a development, the letter forms gradually evolve. And by the 6th century, we have the letters of an alphabet that can be recognized as Arabic by us, that has been developed. And the transition phases have become better understood in very recent years, thanks to the archaeology of Saudi Arabia in particular, and also of Jordan. So the Arabs of northwestern Arabia develop a particular strain of script for their own purposes, which, as far as we know, are fairly limited. And in the 6th century, it begins to spread. We have very few inscriptions from that period, but this one, for instance, is from Zabad in northern Syria. So we're in the very north of the Arabian cultural sphere, and you can see that it's from a church, and it's a trilingual inscription. You have Greek and Syriac next to the Arabic. So the hypothesis that's been put forward about this by Christian Robin is that the rise of this more regular Arabic script that you begin to see, more regular because you have this straight baseline and you have straight vertical letters that are inclined in regular directions, that this script may have been developed in the context of the spread of Christianity among the Arabs. And there's a very active missionary activity in the 6th century towards the Arabs, which is part of a broader movement whereby Christianity also arrives in Ethiopia, in Armenia, and often you have script that goes along with this type of development. As far as we know, the Arabs don't write books in the pre-Islamic period, or if they do, it's something quite exceptional. The rise of Islam in the early 7th century is going to create a completely new momentum. According to tradition, after the Quran is revealed and memorized by the Prophet, he spreads it to his companions. And then, as his companions start passing away from old age or in battle, there is a risk of losing the text or of corrupting parts of the text, of beginning to have variants enter into circulation. And it's in this context that the Mus'haf, so the Quran bound as a book between two covers, emerges. In the following decades, there is spectacular transformation of script, and it's also a cultural transformation, in the sense that Arabic culture, from being oral, becomes a culture of the book, a culture in which orality remains central, but is enmeshed with the book as a support for memory, learning, and transmission. We have, for the 7th century, a number of documents that survive. Inscriptions, papyri from the administration, and these two types of documents are often dated, which is very useful. And there's a corpus of a few dozen very early fragments of the Quran, which are called the Hijazi tradition in modern scholarship, even though they were probably produced way beyond the Hijaz in the regions dominated by the Islamic Empire. This is one of these rare fragments, which is kept in the collection here. And a large section of the same manuscript is at the British Library in London. In fact, it's the largest single manuscript fragment from this period that survives. What do we see? A script which, by the standards of later Arabic writing, is irregular. If you start looking at individual letter shapes, the scribe is referring to an ideal form, but there is variability in its execution. And this script is still akin to individual handwriting. So we have several manuscripts from that corpus, which were written by more than one scribe. The best studied one, studied by François Desroches, has at least 5 different hands. And each hand takes you to a completely different style, essentially. There is also a certain unity that already exists in this period, because all Hijazi Qur'ans, with very rare exceptions, are written in the vertical format. They are large books, which compensates in broad visual terms for the variability of the script itself. Maybe they were referring to an archetype, a primary book that had existed, but we don't really know why this unity is imposed. Now, jumping ahead by just a few years, barely a few decades, script has profoundly changed. And we're in the reign of Abdul Malik bin Marwan, who's the great state builder of the Umayyad caliphs. He prevails in the second fitna, the second civil war, against Ibn Zubayr at Mecca, and consolidates Umayyad power. He does this, among other things, by rationalizing the administration and tax collection. And on a visual level, by asserting the identity of Islam as a clearly distinct monotheistic religion in a predominantly Christian context. And script is going to play a key role in that development. The earliest context in which we see this is the monumental Mosaic inscription at the Dome of the Rock on Temple Mount in Jerusalem, Abdul Malik's great monument built in 692. The script has been rationalized. First, in form, we have only straight lines which are either horizontal or vertical. Oh. I was trying to go back. Oops, sorry. I just wanted to show you, for comparison again, this manuscript where the strokes go to the left, slightly to the right sometimes, and this creates a sense of relative disorder overall. So that's one element of rationalization, and the additional form is circles for the letter mim here, or semicircles for the letter sad. And the hypothesis that's been put forward by me is that the creation of these new rules, of this new codification, is likely to be linked to the very context of the Dome of the Rock, because mosaicists who are laying out this inscription work with grids. It's their way of operating. And we can also see traces of the tools of the calligrapher reproduced here with mosaic cubes. And the idea has been confirmed by Marcus Milwright recently, who sees several stages within the inscription of refinement of the script. So, Abdul Malik, his circle, his supervisors, create this new script. And once they've done that, they spread it to a range of media. Milestones, which people see on roads, they're very public objects, and perhaps most importantly, coins. Coins which are this big, about 2 centimeters, but they spread all across the land. So the Umayyads convey the identity of their state and their faith through calligraphy. And of course, their reform involves manuscripts of the Quran as well. And in recent years, largely thanks to the work of François Desroches, we've been able to identify a corpus of monumental Umayyad manuscripts, some of which have architectural illuminations. So, once these rules have been set, they remain at the heart of calligraphy. Rules of geometry for the shape of the letters, but also rules of proportion to govern the relationships between part of the letters and between different letters as well. And this remains the cornerstone of Arabic calligraphy to the present day. The Umayyads, and after them the Abbasids, develop these scripts, which we call Kufic. It's a name that's been in use since the Middle Ages in Arabic. And there is a flourishing of Kufic for about 2.5 centuries. Desroches has identified as many as 19 Kufic styles. I repeat, 19. If you think about it, there are 6 canonical scripts in the modern period, plus Nastaliq, 7. So we have these 19 Kufic styles, which have the particularity as well of being devoted to usage in the Quran only. And we have, for the administration and books, a separate strand with more informal cursive handwriting during the early Islamic period. These Kufic Qurans have a simple and austere majesty, especially the finest examples, such as this one. And we see, in the course of these 2 centuries, a development of Quranic orthography as well, from being nearly inexistent in the 7th century, and there's a large project in Germany to study that early orthography in particular, to vocalization with red dots that's more and more complete, and then they add more complexity and layers of notation with different colors and different signs. Until, finally, the early Kufic scripts are superseded by a new aesthetic, which we call the new style. It's not a very charming name, and the reason is that we don't know what they were called originally, so it's the new Abbasid style. And we see preliminary stages of it, probably in the Umayyad period, but it becomes widespread and a Quranic script in the 10th century. The new style is more angular than Kufic, even though we tend to regard by our standards Kufic as angular. The number of angles in a given letter is multiplied. That's one major difference. And the other one is that there is much more play between thin and thick strokes within the letters. Now think about it. To write something like this, you need to turn your pen. Well, here you don't. You can just keep going to the left, but you constantly need to turn your pen with exacting precision. I think this must have been extremely difficult to write and trained for. Now, again, the new style isn't one single script. There's actually a range of styles which we put under this broad umbrella because they share these broad aesthetic characteristics. But whereas Kufic was very closely defined, the letter shapes across manuscripts are a bit like a modern typography in the level of detail, the new style is variable. It's a much more decentralized development, and we don't really understand why yet. We know that in the first century of its spread, which is the 10th century, it's found from the Maghreb, the Western Islamic world, Palermo, Kairouan in Tunisia, to Iran. There's a famous Quran from Isfahan in the new style. And then that it spreads particularly to the Eastern Islamic world, where it seems to be developed for longer than elsewhere, especially under the patronage of the Ghaznavids at Ghazna in modern Afghanistan, the great court of the 11th century in terms of patronage for the Iranian world, and in other centers such as Nishapur. And we suspect that Baghdad is also part of this map, but we have no manuscripts at all from Baghdad for the first 6 centuries of Islam, roughly speaking. It's a huge gap in our knowledge. Why does this new style emerge? Well, historically, we have some elements of explanation. One of them is the study of demography, in particular studies by Richard Bulliet, which suggests that there is a shift between the 9th and the 10th centuries in Muslim societies towards a Muslim majority in the population. And in the 10th century, this becomes a widespread phenomenon. So there are more people, simply put, who need access to the Quran, to be trained, to learn it, and so on. That's one factor. A second factor is the spread of papermaking in the Islamic world. This is a technology from China, which comes through Central Asia in the late 8th century, but it reaches a very fine level of craftsmanship by the 10th century in the Islamic world, when it's deemed good enough, so to speak, to receive the sacred text. And so we have a much wider variety of manuscripts of the Quran, which are created in that period in smaller paper formats. It seems that there's a profusion of Quran manuscripts, perhaps, and broader social context of production, but we're not sure about that. Now, Arabic historians and Persian historians also had an explanation for this, and it was summarized in one name, Ibn Muqla, who was a vizier at the Abbasid court in the early 10th century, who is credited in later writings with the codification of Arabic script that corresponds to the new style. Now, we're not certain that this was true. We're certain that Ibn Muqla was a major calligrapher at Baghdad in the 10th century. The sources show it. There is a debate about whether he was really the creator of this new trend. And much of the debate hinges on a treatise which is ascribed to him, but only preserved in much later manuscripts, and on whether you agree with the idea that it was a work of his. Ibn Muqla is, I think, a subject that will remain debated for some time, and there is a chance that more manuscripts ascribed to him will eventually come to light. The one you see here is a miniature Quran preserved in India, which is the best candidate for being an original work by Ibn Muqla. And the case of Ibn Muqla is also interesting for historiography. That is, for the Arabic conception of art history. Because calligraphy, being a fundamental art form, becomes the subject of art historical writing at a very early stage in Arabic and then in Persian, much earlier than art historical writing in Europe, for instance. And writers in Arabic and Persian have a tendency to ascribe major developments in the script to the genius of a single figure. You have a situation, and then Ibn Muqla comes. He's divinely inspired, perhaps to some extent, and he's able to transform this situation and create a new set of rules. And usually when these writers tell us that there's been a major codification, it means that letters have been codified in a new way. Now, this period, Ibn Muqla or not, is one in which the way things are codified changes. In Kufic, it seems that we have geometrical grids in which the script is set. From this time onwards, there's a simpler system which is devised with the letter Alif that's used as the diameter of a circle, and theoretically, the rest of the alphabet is constructed by inscribing letters within the same circle. And the advantage is obvious. It's that you create, without having to think about it too much, a set of proportional relationships between your different letters and letter parts. The whole idea of proportion comes ultimately from the Greeks, largely, and Plato. It's present among early Christian writers, especially those who write about architecture. And the Arabs, before Islam, have their own concepts of cosmic harmony, which probably make these ideas very easy and natural to adopt. So we have a new codification that comes into existence. And that creates the new style. But then a few decades later, the same principles are applied to cursive styles of writing. And this is what gives rise to modern styles of calligraphy. The sources ascribe this change to Ibn al-Bawwab, who lived in Baghdad in the late 10th to early 11th centuries, who also lived in Shiraz for a short time, and who is revered as a calligrapher for all subsequent history. Now, the problem is, as with Ibn Muqla, and as with several of their successors, that there are many forged manuscripts in their names. And so we don't exactly know what their work may have been. This manuscript here is, again, the best candidate we have to be an original work by Ibn al-Bawwab. And you can see that this is a more fluid script than the ones that we've seen before. There's an obvious advantage again, which is that you can write it more quickly while remaining very elegant in your output. And letter forms are very precise, which for the classical tradition is always a key aspect of fine calligraphy. So if you take any letter, like a final meme, you're going to see very nearly identical shapes between different occurrences. But there is a problem, again, which is that a scholar who's done recently a PhD thesis about Qur'ans of the 11th and 12th centuries, Alia Karame, at the end of having studied all of this, including Ghaznavid Qur'ans, came back to this manuscript. And a lot of things seemed to her by then like they fell out of place for around the year 1000, which is the year given in the colophon. The script is much more mature than anything you find in the 11th century, especially early 11th century. The illumination has got some aspects, like the gradation of colors of these petals, which, again, only really begin to occur in the late 12th or 13th centuries. You find that in the Ilkhanid period in particular. But the manuscript also has devices which go back to Kufic manuscript very closely. So she's opening the authenticity of this manuscript into question. It's quite a complex issue. So it's one where, again, I think there will be more questions asked in coming years. But so perhaps we need to move away from this star manuscript, which anyone who studied Islamic art, even superficially, will probably have heard about, to look at the broader picture. And the broader picture is that in the 11th and 12th centuries, there's a proliferation of cursive styles. And one problem has been that when they have been published until now, they've been called muhakkak, perhaps, or nasr, or rayhan, the names of modern scripts. But they're not what we call today muhakkak, or rayhan, or thuluth. The conception that we have ourselves of these scripts is historically contingent. It's based on the Ottoman tradition as it reached its peak in the 16th century and its later developments until the 19th century. This is the canon that we refer to, generally speaking. Now, if you analyze scripts in detail, which is rarely done in scholarship, you begin to see that all of these scripts have elements of muhakkak, thuluth, nasr, and so on, but none of them is exactly any of these scripts. They're all hybrid. And the reason is that the canon that we know was being created at the time. And as far as we can tell, there was a variety of centers which came to prominence for decades, such as Ghazna and Nishapur, and then people circulated between them, and then styles were transferred and again transformed. It was a complex process with multiple centers, which we don't understand yet. But what we know is that this phase comes to an end towards the late 13th, early 14th centuries. Again, the Arabic-Persian tradition associates this fundamental transformation with the name of Yaqut al-Mustasimi. And a recent study, which isn't published yet, based on her PhD thesis by Nuran Ben Azzuna, has studied the manuscripts attributed to Yaqut in great detail, as well as the historical context. And her conclusions are that out of 134 manuscripts, known manuscripts attributed to him, 11 can be confidently ascribed to Yaqut. Most of the rest are probably forgeries. Yaqut himself is a very interesting figure. His name, Yaqut, probably means that he was a slave, a white slave of Turkish Anatolian origin, perhaps. Al-Mustasimi, because he started his career in the service of the last Abbasid Caliph, Al-Mustasim, who was killed by the Mongols in 1258. And then Yaqut remains in Baghdad. He enters into the service of al-Juwayni, who's a major Persian vizier of the Ilkhanids, the Mongols. And finally, after the demise of that dynasty, he seems to work for the market for 1 or 2 decades before his death. Now, when you look at a manuscript by Yaqut, you finally have a script which you can call, for instance, Nasr, as we know it. Even though our modern classical definition of Nasr, which is Ottoman, is slightly different from what you see here. There is tremendous regularity in letter shapes, and the earliest sources that speak about Yaqut credit him with creating a new cut of the pen. This is something technical, which has a major impact on the appearance of a script. And I think that Ben Azuna agrees that this may have been one of his contributions. But again, he belongs to a broader context. I should say as well that she has identified manuscripts in a number of styles by Yaqut, Rayhan, Nasr, Muhakkak, and so on. So, looking again at the broader picture, we see that there is the establishment and the refinement in the early 14th century of classical canonical styles of calligraphy. On the left, you have a very fine example of Muhakkak from the collection. On the right, again, Muhakkak by perhaps, in technical terms, the greatest calligrapher of that age, Ahmad bin Suhrawardi. You can see that there is even more clarity and firmness and mastery of the line than with Yaqut. And it's very supple at the same time. Now, the idea exists in some sources that Suhrawardi was a pupil of Yaqut, but apparently, again, according to this study, he wasn't. He was one of his contemporaries who lived longer and perhaps was able to work under a renewed phase of Ilkhanid patronage when the Mongols convert to Islam. And in broader terms, we really see the emergence of what we call the 6 pens, al-Aqlam al-Sitta. And in the Ottoman tradition, they're usually paired as Tawqi' and Rika, Muhakkak and Rayhan, Nasr and Thuluth. This is a modern example of the scribes by someone I will mention at the end of the lecture. And so from then on, the evolution continues, but it becomes more subtle within the broad framework that's set in this period. The 6 pens are also found in the same period, 14th century, in the Mamluk Empire, where there is first a predominance of Muhakkak in the 14th century, and then of Nasr. In Iran, in the 14th century, a new script is developed on the basis of Nasr, Nasta'liq, which is reserved generally for writing the Persian language and later for Urdu in India. And a recent study by Elaine Wright suggests that it was developed from Nasr and not Nasr and Ta'liq, as is commonly assumed. So the Mongol period is a new watershed in the development of calligraphy. And what's created at that time is consolidated under the Timurids, who have their capital at Samarkand and then Herat in modern Uzbekistan and Afghanistan. And the Timurid also create, or at least establish, the institution of the Kitab Khane, the royal workshop in which the finest craftsmen of the land are brought together to create a unified imperial art. And they set the standard for the 3 great early modern empires of Islam, the Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Mughals in India. There's a movement of craftsmen at the end of the Timurid period as well, towards several of these centers. So the Ottomans, in the early period, 16th century, produce still manuscripts in muhaqqaq, such as this one in the collection, but they become the great historical masters of nasr and thuluth. And these are still the two fundamental styles that are taught in the Ottoman school today. And their definitions, in a sense, color the writing of other scripts in the Ottoman tradition as well, more than with the Mamluks, for instance, when you look at muhaqqaq. Highly refined manuscripts are produced in Iran, at the courts, but also at Shiraz, which is, in the 16th century, a center for the production of the most luxurious type of Quran with astonishing color and illumination, as well as calligraphy. And this is the period in which India enters into the cultural fold of Iran in terms of calligraphy. To the point where there is a corpus of manuscripts which cannot be very securely attributed to Shiraz or Golconda in southern India, because the production in these two centers is so similar in the second half of the 16th century. And things continue to develop. So in Iran, in the early 18th century, there's a new iteration of nasr which develops. The letter forms are broadly similar to what they are in the Ottoman tradition, but the strokes become bolder as a general rule, and the baseline of writing is flatter, which gives a different appearance to the script if you start looking in a bit of detail. This transformation is ascribed to Nayrizi, who works at the court of Shah Abbas in the early 18th century. And this type of nasr remains predominant in Iran well into the 19th century, and in India as well, even though, interestingly, Ottoman-type nasr seems to return to India in the 19th century. So things are in constant movement. But what we've been looking at so far is only a small part of the total map of the development of Islamic calligraphy. It's the central part. It's fundamental, and it's the most technically accomplished. I think you can say that, but it's not the only one. So let's move west first to the Maghreb, the Islamic West, which for much of its history includes Spain as well, and to West Africa, which has Islamic empires from an early date, 11th century. The Maghreb witnesses a separate strand of evolution, which is very interesting. First, they keep on writing Kufic for much longer than everybody else. So we have this recently identified corpus of Maghrebi Kufic Qur'ans, which are probably produced until the mid-11th century, perhaps for a bit longer than that. The form of the letter is very close to classic Kufic types, a style called D in Desroches' classification of all these scripts. And they're distinguished by a very complex vocalization system with red dots, but also with a range of other signs, which helps recitation as well as orthography, and begins to develop quite early on in the Maghreb, maybe in the 9th century. And one of the major writers about orthographic system in early Qur'ans comes from this region, and he's called Ad-Dani, from Denia in modern Spain. But just as people are still writing Kufic, I should open a parenthesis. So we have an interesting source as well, which mentions in Cordoba in the 11th century, 170 female copists of the Quran in Kufic scripts in Cordoba. And it's interesting because they're women as well. And we have evidence about women calligraphers throughout history, although it's not been collected yet. There is then a second development, which is the rise of a script which is commonly called Maghrebi today, but was named Mabsut in historical sources from the 15th century onwards in the Maghreb. And it's a script which is developed on the basis of Maghrebi bookhands of the 9th century. So it's a parallel process to what happens in the East. Cursive bookhands become more codified and are turned into Quranic calligraphy. And this is one of the earliest examples. It's dated 1040. A recent PhD thesis by Umberto Bongianino has uncovered a lot of the earlier phases of that process as well. And the lower part, which is the colophon of this Quran, is in the same Maghrebi Kufic style, which we've just looked at. Compared to what we've been looking at so far, Mabsut is an entirely different story, as you can see. And there are several fundamental reasons for that. The first is that there's a completely different cut of the pen in the Maghreb, which is cut to a sharp point rather than a long edge. And this fundamentally affects the appearance of the script. The other reason is that people don't use the same approach to codification in the Maghreb as in the East. This is an Eastern codification. This is Nasr. You see that each letter is defined extremely precisely. Number of dots, inclination, thickness of each stroke. And the way that it's learned is that you're going to spend a very long time writing the letter Alif before you turn to the letter Ba. And it's going to take several months in traditional training before you start writing groups of letters, and let alone whole words, let alone compositions of your own. Just to give you an idea, modern training in the Ottoman tradition in Istanbul requires 3 years of full-time study to master a single script like Nasr. Now, we have a few historical sources and 19th century observations from the Maghreb, which suggest that people just learn the script more simply by copying a model and being corrected by a teacher in the Maghreb. And they don't seem to have this very precise definition of the letters as well. This means the script is more free-flowing. And the upside of that is that it gives more freedom to the calligrapher. And you have much more spontaneous creativity as a whole in the Maghrebi sphere because you have fewer constraints. So later, Mabsut developed into different forms, such as these very long and flat Sad-type letters, or the way that final Ha or Ta marbuta goes upwards like this. Interestingly, people in the Maghreb retain features of early Qur'ans for much longer than anywhere else in the Islamic world, such as the use of certain vowel or orthographic shapes and colors. And here we are in the 18th century. Or, if I go back, things like, there's no example here, verse markers and illumination from early Qur'ans. It's more conservative in a sense. You also see in the Maghreb this type of script, which broadly resembles Eastern Thuluth, but you can't call it that because it's quite different in the way each letter is articulated. So we call it Maghribi Thuluth, and it's in inscriptions from quite an early date onwards. And there's a second or third, rather, major style that develops from smaller bookhands, which is called mujawhar in the sources, and it becomes widespread in the early modern period, 16th to 17th centuries, even though it exists earlier. This manuscript in the collection is also very interesting because of this illumination, which have some features that resemble Islamic ceramics from the Ottoman Empire, and it probably dates from the period in which Tunisia had just recently come under Ottoman rule. But this type of script continues to be used predominantly in the Maghreb until the 19th century. Only in the 20th century do Ottoman styles of writing become more widespread in those regions. It also spreads along the coast of Africa to Mauritania. So we have versions of Mabsut that comes from Mauritania in the 18th, 19th centuries. And there's a second, well, I won't count numbers anymore. There's another major tradition which is separate and emerges in West Africa. It was called Sudani for a long time, but Brigalia and Nobili have recently proposed the probably more appropriate name, Barnawi Kanami, which is after the empires in Central Africa, Bornu and Kanem, out of which it's likely to have a reason. And so we're in the region between the north of Nigeria, where it's still written today, Chad, and the south of Mali. A region in which we have inscriptions for Mali from the 11th century onwards in Arabic. There's a debate again about these manuscripts. For a long time, it was assumed that they were derived from Maghrebi, Mabsut, in part because of aspects of their illumination, of their orthography as well, which resembles Maghrebi orthography, so this type of verse marker as well. A very interesting aspect of this manuscript is their larger illuminations resonate with African textiles too. But a new hypothesis has been put forward based on some specific letter shapes and the overall angularity of the script. And the hypothesis is that this is a derivative of the new style, of the angular scripts that we've looked at just a moment ago, which we know were practiced especially in Tunisia for a fairly long time into the medieval period. So it's a hypothesis based on formal resemblances, and there's a huge chronological gap. The earliest African Quran with a date is 1669, even though there were probably much earlier manuscripts produced. So after going west, let's go east. I'm going to look now at this fringe region compared to the core region between the Nile, the Oxus, and the Indus, where the canonical styles develop. This is a region linked by the Indian Ocean, in which we see distinct stylistic developments. First of all, in India, there's this type of style, which is, again, quite angular and has very strong contrasts between thin and thick strokes, which is called Bihari, although we don't know where the name comes from and how old it is, and which seems to emerge, or at least to be widespread, in India by the 14th century in the north, and perhaps more towards the northeast of India, towards Bengal. And it's been studied by Héloïse Braque de la Perrière in recent years. Bihari is a mystery. It's a fairly coherent corpus in both script and illumination. Again, the rules are much less precise than in the core regions, like in the Maghreb, but there's a lot of vitality about the script as well. And it seems to be associated with Sufi circles in India in that period. That's her hypothesis, at least. But we don't understand yet where it came from because it's so different from anything else that we know. But Bihari isn't an isolated style. In India itself, it starts to be superseded by classical Iranian style in the 16th century, as we saw. But it's still produced. We have 19th century Bihari manuscripts still. And the collection here has got an important number of these. It will probably be one of the largest publications about Bihari when it comes out. But when you go to East Africa, you begin to see intriguing things. So, this is probably from Somalia in the 19th century, and we have a script which is much bolder than Nasr, but which in form is closely related to classical Nasr. And yet, at the same time, in the same broad region, so here we're in Harar, in Ethiopia, 18th century, we have completely different styles, which are very angular and have a broad resemblance to Bihari. And this is a pattern which you see across the Western Indian Ocean region, with some patterns that can be linked to Egypt, that appear in Yemen, but also in Ethiopia, and that's both for script and illumination. And you have some echoes, but more distant, that perhaps resemble this in Southeast Asia as well. So intriguingly, even though India is close to Iran and Ethiopia is close to Egypt, there seems to be an Indian Ocean specific visual language that develops in the long term. And this takes us to the furthest extent of our map, Southeast Asia and then China. Southeast Asian Qur'ans are original, especially in terms of their illumination. They're all late 18th century and mostly 19th century. And the vast majority use a script that's closely related to Nasr. Clearly, they're trying to emulate Nasr, but perhaps without the full baggage of codification that goes with it. And through illumination, it's possible, thanks to the work of Annabel Gallop, to ascribe these types of manuscripts fairly precisely to different parts of maritime Southeast Asia. So this one must be from the Patani Kingdom, which is between the south of Thailand and the north of Malaysia. And China has Muslim merchant settlements, which are significant from the 8th century onwards without interruption. And the earliest manuscripts, which are again late, 15th century probably, show a fully formed style which resembles the muhakkak of the central regions with its very long oblique descenders in particular. That's a key feature of muhakkak. But the letter shapes are different. The roundedness that you see here, the huge size of meme, and most of all the proportions, which are key to classical calligraphy, are completely transformed. So this tradition is only starting to be known. We have very few dated examples yet. One example is in the collection here, and there is again a lot of variability in Chinese muhakkak, and there are other styles practiced as well. This manuscript is very interesting. There's another similar one at the David collection in Copenhagen, because it's dated and it's from Beijing, and the scribe is a female, and we know that there is a tradition of women's mosque that's particular to China. It may be related to that social context. And it has architectural and floral illumination that are very distinctive. So I've submitted it to quite harsh critical investigation to check that it's authentic, and so far it's made it. It seems to be authentic. Finally, I'm going to end my world tour with Dagestan, a region known today for the saddest reasons in general, but which was a major center of Islamic manuscript production from quite an early time onwards, 12th century perhaps, and which continued to produce very original calligraphy, which doesn't look like Nasr really, or like anything within the classical canon, even though it's close to Iran, until the 20th century. And again, we have this division between codification, which gives mastery and elegance and beauty to scripts, for which calligraphy is famous, and regions where they're not used and where you have this explosion of highly original developments. And maybe this is nicely epitomized by the work on the right, which is by a Moroccan calligrapher of the 19th century called al-Kandusi, who really plays with the plastic possibilities of Arabic script, and he's very individual and distinctive in that sense. And on the left, a tradition which develops in the late 19th and early 20th centuries in Ottoman Turkey, especially Bursa, in Sufi circles, and that is to remove all the flesh of a plant leaf and then to write a thuluth composition on it. And probably it has a meaning about transience as well for those who make it, even though we have no documents. Standing in any part of the Islamic world at that point in the 19th century, you could have been forgiven for thinking this was a strongly rooted and flourishing tradition. The Ottoman Empire in particular created dozens of new forms in which to articulate and display calligraphy in the 19th century. But things were to change at the end of that century. There are a number of factors for that. One of them is the rise of European modes of learning, which leads to a decrease in the social status of traditional learning in the Islamic world, traditional learning to which calligraphy is quite closely associated. Another one is the development of print in Arabic, which is resisted originally and poses technical difficulties as well. You need 4 times as many types for Arabic printing as for a European language. In the 19th century, there's a new technology called lithography, which changes this situation and is very widely adopted in the Islamic world. And finally, from being a script that's written from China to West Africa, from also being the script in which dozens of African languages are written in the early modern period, Arabic is displaced in a number of regions by English and French in Africa, by Latin script in Southeast Asia, Cyrillic in Russia and then the USSR, and perhaps with even more cultural violence by the Latin script in Turkey in 1928. And in Turkey, Istanbul is arguably the greatest center of calligraphy in the world. All of a sudden, an infrastructure that created positions in which trained calligraphers were secure in employment and were also respected in society disappear. Dozens of masters of this craft go into unemployment and begin to practice only in private or occasionally in art schools. In the 1950s, there is a resurgence of interest in Ottoman calligraphy among young people. And a number of old masters trained in the Ottoman tradition are still alive at that time, and they're able to pass on their knowledge to this new generation. So this story of Istanbul, which has been studied in a recent PhD by Francesco Stermatic Capellari, is extraordinary. It's a history of decline, but also resilience. And today, you could say that Istanbul is the greatest center for the study of Arabic calligraphy in the world, even though Iranians may not be very happy with that, because they're also keeping it up in their country, especially Nastaliq. But so we have transmission chains, which are like those of Sufi orders among calligraphers, which start in the 16th century. I'm sorry, this is illegible, but this is Sheikh Hamdullah, the great 16th century calligrapher, and reach to these late Ottoman masters. One major name is Hamid Aytaç, who's important because he was born in 1891, so he was 30 by the demise of the Ottoman Empire, and he dies in 1982. So he represents, if you like, the bridge between these two ages. And Hassan Çelebi, who is perhaps today the most famous calligrapher in Istanbul, is one of his students, and he has attracted dozens of students from across the world, and there are major international competitions which are held every year there. The ijaza, the traditional diploma in calligraphy, is still delivered to the highest standard in Istanbul. And we also have women calligrapher, again, Hilal Kazan is one of the best known ones today, and people from other countries, so Fuad Hunda in Japan, also Muhammad Zakaria, who's American by origin, and who wrote the 6 scripts that I showed you earlier. And there's been a flourishing of other uses of Arabic calligraphy in modern art, in painting, sculpture, installation art, and perhaps the medium that resonates most with everyday life is graffiti in cities like Tunis, Cairo, Beirut, Tehran. And this finds a real resonance in the world and in the art market today. So I will end this with a wish, which is that the traditional forms which have survived to this day may be more widely taught to the highest level tomorrow. Thank you very much.